From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, I am Estefania Bravo. This is From the South. Sri Lanka's president has announced he is changing his defense chief after Sunday's church attacks. The president said the defense force failed to act on intelligence information regarding the attacks. Reports say intelligence officials had been warned by their Indian counterparts hours before the first bomb went off. The officials, however, failed to take any action to stop the attacks that killed at least 321 people.
I will completely restructure the police and security forces in the coming weeks. I expect to change the heads of defense establishments within the next 24 hours. The security officials who got the intelligence report from a foreign nation did not share it with me. Appropriate actions would have been taken. I have decided to take stern actions against these officials.
Over 4,000 Christians were killed in 2018, according to the organization Open Doors. More than 3,000 were arrested and almost 2,000 churches were attacked. According to the report, the most dangerous countries to be a Christian are Nigeria, where 87% of the killings took place, North Korea, Afghanistan, and Somalia. The judges on the Supreme Court in Brazil have unanimously voted to reduce the prison sentence against the former president Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. 4 judges voted to reduce the sentence to 8 years and 10 months. Lula was sentenced to 12 years and 1 month in January last year in connection with the so-called triplex corruption case. The ruling means that Lula could be released in September of this year to finish his sentence under house arrest. Our correspondent Brian Muir has the details.
The 5th Working Group of the Brazilian Federal Supreme Justice Court just issued a ruling reducing the prison sentence for former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva from 12 years and 1 month down to 8 years and 10 months. Now, a lot of legal scholars are saying that this was done basically to preempt a decision that's about to be made by the Federal Supreme Court regarding imprisonment of people who've had their second appeals denied. Because last April, they had to open an exception enabling them to arrest Lula during election season while his appeals processes were still underway. And that ruling from last April affects the lives of thousands of people in Brazil. So the expectation is that they're going to ban people from being arrested after their second appeal is denied, as was the case of Lula. And so what happened today, in a very quick manner, the courts pushed through his third appeals process without even informing his defense team that it was going to go on. Now, there's such a lack of evidence. There's no material evidence whatsoever implicating Lula in any crime of corruption. So they had to do something. So they made the symbolic gesture of lowering his sentence. However, this move to lower his sentence opens the path for him to be removed from solitary confinement and possibly being put under house arrest. He's been in solitary in violation of the Mandela rules for over a year now. So the idea that he could be transferred to house arrest is being viewed positively by the millions and millions of supporters of the former president.
We thank Brian Muir for that update. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez has warned about the far right during a debate between the 4 main candidates for Sunday's general election. The 2 candidates of the right-wing parties, Pablo Casado of the Popular Party and Albert Rivera of the Ciudadanos Party, lashed out on the Prime Minister. They accused them of betraying Spain for attempting to negotiate with Catalan pro-independence leaders. Meanwhile, Sánchez stressed he would never agree to an independence referendum.
The independence parties and the right parties know that independence is not going to happen. They know it's not going to happen. They know that the problem in Catalonia is not the independence. The problem is the coexistence. And that is why we are suggesting to dialogue inside the limits of the Constitution, facing this coexistence problem. That is what this government has been doing.
And the leader of the right-wing Popular Party, Pablo Casado, has criticized the way the Prime Minister has handled the Catalan crisis.
It's obvious. You have already packed it, and that's why you're not telling us if you're going to pardon or not the prisoners of the coup d'etat. Why you gave instructions to the Attorney General to change the penal classification of the prisoners? Why you gave instructions to the prosecutor? Why you gave instructions to the Supreme Court according to the front page of a media? Because as long as you continue in Moncloa, you make pacts even with the Morning Star.
Our correspondent Eduardo Marin has more details on the debate.
The second debate has ended ahead of the general election on Sunday here in Spain. During this debate, there were more attacks than in the first one. Maybe because this time, the candidates did not have a time frame to answer. Candidates also addressed several topics that were not debated during the first debate on Monday evening, and that are of great interest for the voters, like healthcare issues, education, and housing. The leader of the Socialist Party, Pedro Sanchez, had to respond to the attacks of the other three candidates. Analysts say that Sanchez has responded quite well to the attacks and has spoken about what the Socialist Party is offering. The electoral campaign is coming to an end on Friday, before the Spanish people elect their new House of Representatives and Senate.
We thank Eduardo Marin for that report. Prime Minister Sanchez is seeking a second term in office, but the socialist leader will almost certainly have to reach agreements with other parties if he is to form another government.
The Socialist Party has reached the final stretch of the campaign as the front-runner according to the polls. But it is still unclear which parties might support the Socialists to keep them in government. For that reason, the PSOE is sending a clear message to Spanish citizens. They are the only ones who can stop a possible right-wing coalition. According to Pedro Sanchez, the return of the right, including the far-right Vox Party, would be a huge setback for people's rights.
Do we want to move forward or step backwards? For the Socialist Party, moving forwards means social justice, living all together, with greater transparency, and stepping backwards, which is what the right-wing bloc proposes, means more cuts and more inequality, the return of corruption, conflict between regions, and greater political tension. And we don't want that.
The polls predict good results for the PSOE, but that hasn't stopped the criticism. The Podemos party complains they do not really promote left-wing policies and bow to demands of the EU. Social movements accuse them of forgetting people in need, such as undocumented migrants and homeless people, while the Popular Party and Ciudadanos condemn them for negotiating with the Catalans. That's why the PSOE has no clear alliances for after the elections.
The Socialist Party will probably win these elections, but winning does not mean ruling, and if the three right-wing parties have the majority of seats, they will rule. We know what happened in Andalusia. Nobody believed they were going to rule, and they are ruling.
The socialist proposals include increasing the average wage, a national plan for jobs in rural areas and for women and youth, and fighting job insecurity and the wage gap. They also promised talks with the Catalan separatists. From prison, where he is awaiting trial, the leader of Esquerra Republicana said he will never open the door to a far-right government in Spain.
We will not set any red line that means a blank check for the far-right. Likewise, we'll never give a blank check that is an obstacle to our aspirations of building a new republic.
In 2016, Pedro Sanchez was ousted by his own party. In 2017, he unexpectedly won the primaries to become the PSOE Secretary General again. In 2018, a no-confidence vote brought him to office. And in 2019, he may be just a few days away from becoming Prime Minister again. That's if, this time, he wins the elections.
Moving on, Venezuela's communications minister held a press conference where he spoke about the investigation into the attacks on the country's power grid. Rodriguez said that suspects who are directly involved in the attacks on the Guri hydroelectric dam are based in Colombia and in the U.S.
We are searching for him by way of Interpol so that he can answer to justice in Venezuela. Terrorism should be a crime in which countries of the world collaborate with the investigation, and at this time, with a terrorist act of such magnitude, if it was carried out in any other country, and it was the case that the perpetrators sought refuge in Venezuela, we would immediately hand them over to the country which fell victim to the terrorist attack.
Solidarity groups have mobilized to defend the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. They say that Venezuelan opposition proxies will try to take over the office and say that the next 2 days are crucial. The collective, which is currently inside of the embassy, says it's too prepared to remain there in order to protect the sovereignty of Venezuela. Activists say that for the last 2 years, the corporate media has propped up stories on Russian interference in U.S. elections, yet the U.S. has been actively interfering inside the political affairs of other countries. Medea Benjamin of the organization Code Pink says that the U.S. government has teamed up with the Venezuelan opposition in blatant violation of the Vienna Convention. The group also wants Trump's administration to know that any kind of military intervention is unauthorized by Congress and illegal.
And as we get closer to the date where we think the opposition is going to try to take over this embassy, we're getting more and more people joining us. Just today, 3 people flew in from California. We have somebody else coming in from Boston. They're coming from all over the country. And we are building up a collective of people who believe in international law and are opposed to the idea that someone can just proclaim himself president, start nominating representatives, and take over the embassy in Washington, D.C. We say that's a violation of the of the Vienna Conventions, and we don't want to allow that to happen.
Can you tell us a bit about what is at stake as far as the embassies and diplomatic offices go, and why a call has been issued to protect the embassy tomorrow in particular?
We saw how the opposition took over 2 buildings in Washington, D.C. on March 18th that belonged to the Venezuela military attaché, and then they took over the consulate in New York City. And we heard them say that they next wanted to take over the embassy. We realized that they were not going to do it probably as long as there were still diplomats from Venezuela inside the embassy. But the State Department had given the remaining diplomats who were part of the Venezuelan mission to the Organization of American States until Wednesday to leave the country. And that means that as of Thursday, there would be no more diplomats here. There are staff, but they don't have diplomatic status. And that is why we think that on Thursday, the Guaido representatives might try to come with the Secret Service police and enter this building.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. Mexican authorities detained a group of migrants along a road in southern Mexico and now could be deported. Among those detained in the state of Chiapas were mothers with their children escaping poverty and violence in Central America. Government data shows Mexico has ramped up detentions of migrants. This also follows criticism from U.S. President Donald Trump that the Mexican government isn't doing enough to stop migration. Our correspondent in Mexico, Eduardo Martinez, brings us more.
Authorities from the National Migration Institute have arrested around 367 people on the road that connects the Mapastepec and Pijijiapan municipalities. They said the arrest took place as a part of migration control measures because all people who enter the country have to register with immigration. This registration enables people to get the proper documents to move freely around Mexico. There are around 6,000 people waiting for their situation to be regulated in the state of Chiapas. Many of them hope to reach the northern border with the United States. We are now in a shelter where the majority of migrants come from Central American countries. They are waiting here while the documents they need for regulating their migration status are processed.
We thank Eduardo for that report. Argentinians have taken to the streets of Buenos Aires in a national day of protest against the government's economic policies. Farmers gave away about 20,000 kilos of fruit to demand fair prices for their produce. The event was organized by the Union of Rio Negro and Neuquén workers. They demand that the government pays a $1.50 per kilo subsidy for their harvest to help them overcome the crisis.
The farmer is experiencing a critical situation. He's broke. He's just earning 50% of what costs him to produce. And this means he can't do any other job at the farm. He can't invest. He can't generate anything new. And he has to stop doing things. All this is what is happening to the farmer.
The former executive director of Odebrecht in Peru has confirmed the company contributed to the campaign of former President Alan Garcia in 2006. Jorge Barata said the Brazilian construction company gave $200,000 to the campaign through Garcia's former interior minister. Barata revealed this during an interrogation in Brazil regarding the corruption case. Alan Garcia shot himself last week just before being arrested in Lima, linked to the case. Security forces in Guatemala have arrested the former health minister Jorge Villavicencio. Villavicencio has been on the run since January after the prosecutor tried to arrest him for alleged fraud, abuse of power, and embezzlement. The former health minister served under the government of former President Otto Pérez Molina, who is also being investigated for corruption. Women are making headway in Brazilian politics even as the administration of President Jair Bolsonaro threatens the representation of minorities in the country. One example is Tabata Amaral, who has been voted into Brazil's lower house of Congress and will have a platform to give a voice to women and young people. However, the situation in the country is dire, with only 77 of 513 members of the lower house identifying as women. Brazil remains one of the countries with the lowest representation of women in Congress.
The lower house of Congress is not accustomed to women. I think this is quite evident. It is as if we are a foreign body that needs to be expelled. Speaking of the first few days, I was constantly barred from entering, and they wanted to know if I was even a federal or state deputy, where I had found the badge we carry as deputies and just very absurd questions. From now on, my mission is to bring more people into politics, especially the young, women, and people from peripheral neighborhoods, because we are a very rare animal here in Congress.
Argentina women's football team Boca Juniors has turned professional, but the players are still demanding equal conditions. The players said they still have to work several jobs to make a living and have to cover their own transport and medical care costs. Being professional for women in the game has only just become a reality, with the team signing a professional contract on April 12th.
It's very difficult for a woman to dedicate herself to football. I mean, you can't. You have to do a lot of things. And that's what I always say. When you work or study at the same time, you can't perform at 100% on the pitch. You don't have the conditions to do so. And then it just so happens that women's national team doesn't do so well.
For me, this is the beginning of something new, but it has to be much bigger. There will be older players like me and some others to keep fighting, so that those that come up behind us will have more opportunities and things will be much easier. We had a difficult time. They're going to go through a lot of things, but maybe less than us. But there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you keep fighting.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. In a surprising turn of events, the government of Eritrea has closed all its border crossings with neighboring Ethiopia. They were opened a few months ago after being closed for 2 decades. The government has offered no official explanation for the new closure, although it does suggest disagreements between Addis Ababa and Asmara. The opening of border crossings last year was viewed as the end of the military standoff between the two countries. Thousands of protesters in Algeria have called for sweeping changes following an anti-graft drive against figures close to the former president. 5 billionaires were arrested on Monday as part of an anti-corruption investigation. Last week, the army chief announced that members of the ruling elite are expected to be prosecuted for graft.
We went out to ask for our rights and to remove them all. We want a government that stands for rights. That's all.
We are fed up with all that, and we want things to change. We want to change, and we want to make this change.
Egypt has voted to give President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi sweeping powers to stay in office until 2030 and to select a third of all Senate members. Our correspondent in Cairo, Nayara Tardo, explains.
This Tuesday, the new Egyptian constitution has been officially approved. The National Electoral Authority held a press conference to report about the outcome of this referendum that started on Friday and finished on Monday evening. According to the National Electoral Authority, the new Egyptian constitution has been approved by 88.83% of the votes, with 61 million people eligible to vote. This new constitution extends the presidency term from 4 to 6 years with 2 consecutive terms, gives women 25% of the parliament seats, and establishes again a vice president position and the upper house of parliament. It also gives authority to the president to name 1 or more vice presidents. It also establishes that the army is the one to protect and guarantee the constitution. This referendum started on Friday for Egyptians living abroad and on Saturday in the country. An international mission has monitored this process.
We thank Nayara Tardo for that report. More than 50 people are feared dead in Myanmar after a landslide hit a major jade mining area in the north of the country. A search and rescue operation is ongoing as bodies are being recovered from the mud. The accident happened when a mud filter pond situated at an old mining site collapsed. Some of the victims have been identified as migrant workers who search for pieces of the precious stones left over from mining operations. At least 32 people have been killed by mudslides and flooding due to torrential rain in South Africa. Officials say the death toll is expected to rise in the Durban and Wasulu native provinces. Rescue teams are looking for survivors under the rubble of collapsed buildings, while several others have been taken to the hospital. Local roads have been destroyed, sewers blocked, and light posts brought down.
Remains after the torrential rain.
Our correspondent in Pretoria, Matuva Valachi, has more.
Heavy rains have been pouring around South Africa, and the worst affected places are the Eastern Cape and the KwaZulu-Natal provinces. Durban in KwaZulu-Natal being the hardest hit, with about 32 people reported to have died in the floods and the mudslides that came with the heavy rains that have been pouring since Monday afternoon. And now the South African National Defence Force has been deployed to the hardest hit areas, which includes KwaZulu-Natal and Eastern Cape in Port St. John's, where people are now being evacuated because these rains are expected to continue, and that means more damage will be caused to people's homes. And now people are being evacuated in the hardest hit areas. Even here in the economic hub, Johannesburg, the rains have wreaked havoc on the roads, with many accidents being counted and people being injured, and unfortunately no fatalities. But the low-lying areas are the ones prone to accidents and houses that will fall apart, and that's where rescue workers and the National Defense Force have been deployed to evacuate people and be on alert for any eventuality. But now, and the emergency services are telling us that the death toll is expected to rise because there are still people who have not been accounted for, especially in Durban, in KwaZulu-Natal province, where there's already 32 people that have been killed. But we keep tabs on the story as it unfolds. It's back to you, studio.
We thank Matua for that report. Armenians have commemorated the anniversary of what they called the genocide committed by Ottoman Turks in 1915. Citizens have marched in capital Yerevan carrying torches and waving their national flag. The mass killing of Christian Armenians during World War I led to the death of up to 1.5 million people. However, Turkey contests the figures and denies it was a genocide. And with that story, we've come to the end of this news brief. These and other stories, as always, find them on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Estefania Bravo. Thank you for watching.